I'm with Douglas Skopp today. He's president of Dionysus, a importer of boutique small production wines from Europe to the United States, in particular to Texas. He's based in Houston, and I happen to know that his professional training was as a mechanical engineer. So Doug, perhaps I could start today by asking, how does a mechanical engineer end up as the importer of some of the most expensive wines in the world?
Well, I had a very successful career in mechanical engineering, actually studying combustion, very technical, and it brought me to many great places where I eventually started to discover the wonders of wine. In one of my earlier companies, I spent a lot of time on the West Coast and in the San Francisco Bay Area. Eventually got curious and found myself, when I had some spare time, driving up places like Montebello Road, and I think Ridge Vineyards was one of my earlier finds, and became a big fan of a certain style of wine. And over time in my career, I started to travel internationally. So as I'm learning about wine, I'm finding myself lost in some of the wine regions of Europe. I had one trip in particular, probably about 15 years ago, where I was had an extra 3 or 4 days of nothing to do. I was supposed to meet my distributor in Italy. We were going to give a combustion course, and unfortunately my distributor was ill and he was my translator, so I had the better part of a week to hang out and wait for the next part of my trip. Well, I happened to be in the south of France at the time, and I had never actually been into the Rhone Valley at that point. I was always curious. I was studying the wines, tasting the wines back in the States. So I drove, I spent about 3 or 4 days in the Rhone. I just absolutely fell in love with it. The first morning that I woke up, I started to drive, and there was a street sign that pointed 4 or 5 directions. It said Vaccaras this way, Gigondas that way, Châteauneuf-du-Pape. Immediately I'm thinking, this sounds like a wine list, not a road sign. And it got my curiosity going, and started to visit these villages. And these villages are full of these small little mom and pop producers. And I basically started to wander in, try the wines, and get to know the people. And that's how I started it originally in France, and eventually the same thing in Italy.
So these small wineries were not represented by anybody in the United States market?
Many of the wineries that I have picked up, I am the only importer for. In fact, my very first Italian winery, called Gino Roagna, this gentleman is not represented by anybody else in the world. I am his only client outside of Piemonte. The man makes probably maybe a few thousand cases, and I actually buy a sizable portion of what he makes. I have a couple of wineries like that. This person has never even been to U.S., never even been on an airplane for that matter, and in fact doesn't even have an internet connection. We have to communicate by the old-fashioned fax, and he uses an old manual Olivetti typewriter for all the correspondence.
Wow, that's back in a time warp. And who do you sell these wines to? Is it principally to restaurants, where I suppose your customer is a sommelier or a chef who thinks this will be a wine his customers would like? Or is it to retail stores?
It's very heavily restaurants. In fact, oftentimes I find my wines do definitely, especially the upper end wines, they do better in the restaurants. And sometimes, especially if it's not quite so expensive, it drives the retail. What'll happen is I may place a wine in restaurants, and they'll be just in restaurants. Eventually the clientele will start calling wine shops, where can I find this?
Yeah.
And sometimes I then will get calls from wine shops, boy, I'd like to carry this wine. Or sometimes actually in the case of, there was a local chain of wine shops here in Dallas. I got a call once from their wine buyer, and he said, do you carry this wine? I saw your name on the back label. I had it at so-and-so restaurant. In fact, I think it was maybe even Lucia, one of the local restaurants here.
Here in Dallas, yeah.
In Dallas. And because I'm much slower to the Dallas market than I started in Houston. I was very comfortable with the Houston market for a while. And so he asked me, is that something that I could carry in my shops? I said, well, yeah, sure. So he actually had the wine in the restaurant, enjoyed it, and could not figure out where it came from, or he just saw my name on it.
And that led to a sale. So over the years that you've been selling boutique Italian and French wines in the Texas market, have you noticed a trend towards more consumption or what?
I have definitely noticed a trend going in the direction of more of these smaller artisan wines. When I first got into the industry, it was a little bit of a uphill climb. I found a lot of sommeliers, or I should say more the wine people at the restaurants, generally felt that these wines are unheard of. My clients aren't going to know them. They don't see them in the grocery stores, and therefore they will not order them. And there did not seem to be the interest in specialization or hand selling. In fact, I was originally told that we only work with the two big Texas distributors, and we really don't have much interest to do anything else. That was then, and this is now. And now I'm seeing just the opposite. I'm going into many new restaurants, and I'm meeting sommeliers who say, look, I'm looking for wines that are exciting, that are special, wines that are not in the grocery stores. I'm looking for wines that people are going to love so much that they're going to come back to my restaurant because I'm carrying these wines.
Right. Well, Doug, you've obviously been very successful, and you've brought a lot of great wines to people like me and our viewers. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.